Excitement, adventure, a backup admin craves not these things. In the world of backups, an exciting day on the job is probably a bad day for everyone else. And backups are one of those things that everyone assumes is there until they need it. A backup is a snapshot in time of a time when things were better, before that server was corrupted or that file was deleted. Backups are a passport to the past. Hey everyone, and welcome to the Anexipod, the official podcast for Anexinet. This is episode 18, recorded June 19th, 2017. I'm your host, Ned Bellavance, Director of Cloud Solutions at Anexinet. And here on the Anexipod, we talk technology for the enterprise, covering infrastructure, app dev, analytics, and anything else that is shiny. On this episode, we will be talking about everyone's favorite topic, backups and recovery. And as much as I'm sure listeners would love to hear me wax poetic about the topic, our guest today can help me keep my feet on the ground. Chris Wahl is the Chief Technologist for Rubrik, a double VCDX, a Microsoft MVP, and co-host of the excellent Datanauts podcast. Welcome to the show, Chris.
Hey, that intro was stellar. I'm very amazed.
Why, thank you. I know the work that you put into the Datanauts intros, and I just wanted you to, feel comfortable here too.
I think you've raised the bar, actually, so appreciate it.
I try.
Glad to be on.
So why don't you tell listeners a little bit about yourself and what you do?
Sure. So in my private life, I'm the owner of wallnetwork.com, which is my blog. And as you've mentioned, co-host a infrastructure and silo busting kind of podcast called Datanauts with my friend Ethan Banks. Mm-hmm. And professionally, I'm the chief technologist at Rubrik, which basically means I get to go around talking about, backups to a degree, but also like what the cool things are about that and next generation data center design and kind of moving the needle forward when it comes to the horrible architectures we have to deal with today.
I have no idea what you're talking about. All data centers are perfect.
Yes, they are all delicate snowflakes.
Oh, so delicate. So everyone's path to the IT world is a little different. I'm curious, how did you arrive in the world of IT?
I don't have one of those revelation stories. I kind of grew up, even as a very young kid, knowing that computers were the thing for me. I was one of those weird 8-year-olds with a BBS that had been programming for, since I was like 5. Mm-hmm. So kind of knew it was my job forever to get a job in IT, and ended up during college, I ended up getting my first job in IT before I graduated, doing like sysadmin work. Basically, IT plumber, the sysadmin help desk, printer, mm-hmm. jockey kind of stuff, and then kind of snowballed from there.
Yeah, that's a fairly common path. I didn't have the revelatory experience either. It was just like, oh, help desk. And now help desk is awful, so I want to get off of help desk. What do I do next?
Yeah, that's pretty common.
Yeah. So Rubrik is primarily a backup company, at least that's the way I encountered it. And I've never had what I'd call a great experience with backups. So I'm curious, what made you want to dive into that world?
I didn't. When I got the call from Bipple, the CEO, he's like, yeah, come join. And I did a little bit of research. I was actually talking to Duncan Epping prior to having a conversation. I was like, backup company? Nope, not even going to take that call. And I don't know, they changed my mind because I realized that backup and recovery wasn't really the main focus. Like, I don't really do a lot of backup and recovery stuff. Mm-hmm. It was around the technologies that are pervasive in our world, like cloud technologies and APIs and writing code that can harness those things, and how to introduce those fun new tech things into the world of backup and recovery, which was a challenge I was willing to take.
Right, and I would definitely say that the backup world, in my experience, is ripe for disruption. Most of the tech that I've worked with is encumbered with these decade-old features and ideas, and it seems like the big vendors are just like, if there is something new, they just try to shoehorn it in, and it makes for a bad experience for everyone.
Yeah, that was exactly my take. I was an enterprise architect for the better part of 5 years, and whenever backup came up, I was like, that's this other guy's problem, because I didn't want to do that world, because you're right, it was always these really kind of heavy legacy things but more than that, more than just the technology being really kind of clunky and boring, it was one of those career paths where it's like, okay, I'm going to be the data collector, the data janitor, and I'm only needed when there's a problem. It didn't feel like you could really move the needle forward much. You were just kind of held within a spot. And prior to being in consulting, I was always the backup person, and it was like one of the many hats that I wore, and it was the least favorite hat, because even when you needed it, it didn't really work that great. So
yeah. And that's when everybody's staring at you like, is it restored yet? Is it restored yet? And you're like, guys, I got to check another set of tapes because this tape is all messed up because it got too close to a magnetic thing. Ugh, Ooh, I have
Exactly. Or hey, I got to go
nightmares.
home and get the other tape because you couldn't afford like a real enterprise vault type system. So
Right.
the enterprise vault is my closet at home. So
Yeah, I worked at one company where the backups, the offsite storage, was put them in a filing box and then put them in the basement of the CEO's house. That was
nice.
our backup vault.
Well, at least they'll be safe.
Oh, yeah, until the basement floods. But that never happens in Pennsylvania. Anyway, so what do you think are the real big areas for improvement and disruption in backups?
I think I would distill that to the point where the backup and recovery process should be kind of the table stakes portion of it, meaning a lot of products, all they're trying to do is just take data, hold it, and offer it to you, usually in kind of a slow way when you need it. And that's it. That's all it does. So kind of departing from backup and recovery being the only use case, but also kind of freeing the data so that you don't have to follow the vendor's specific workflow to get the data and then recover the data. You can kind of figure out what makes sense for you, because I feel like today a lot of it is you take the vendor's architecture and you kind of have to adhere to it versus the other way around where it kind of adheres to what you need, and then you're kind of beholden to whatever their orchestration process is and whatever their user interface is, rather than doing automation with APIs and things like that. So those are the kind of the two big ones for me: the use cases and the workflows. And I think that lends well to, if you're dealing with architecture, I think at any kind of scale, it could be enterprise or even kind of mid-level, it's all about trying to build your own workflows and your own pipelines, and vendors getting in your way. So those are my two big gripes.
Yeah, vendors never stand in anyone's way. I've never heard of such a thing. So you mentioned a couple of really interesting things there, and I just want to focus on one of them, which is the automation and APIs. So when you talk about automation and APIs, can you dive into that topic a little bit more and expand on it?
Yeah, I mean, I spent a lot of time working with cloud management platforms prior to joining Rubrik. So those were typically OpenStack through their various projects, or vRealize automation and orchestration, or even just some kind of off-the-shelf, a way to see and control all of your assets across private and public resources. And that stuff all runs on APIs. Like the cloud, there's no like console, there's no, KVM console port to AWS. It's run by APIs. There's an interface, but nobody really uses it beyond any kind of meaningful scale. Mm-hmm. Whereas you look at backup and recovery, it was always a very manual process, pull the lever, get the banana type of stuff. And trying to put those worlds together was one of my main challenges. And oh man, you try to automate something that was invented in like the Bell Labs era. There's no API, or if there is, it's actually just calling some kind of service running on a Windows box, or it doesn't work well together. So the ability to control data using policy and using APIs is kind of a no-brainer, but it's really been not introduced into the data protection world. And it's one of those things where I think as we continue, I'm not saying everything's going to the cloud, but a lot of things are going to the cloud for various reasons. We can't use these 20 plus year architectures and kind of processes and models to do that. So that's where I tend to get on my soapbox a little bit around why APIs are important. I beat my chest a bit.
Right, that makes sense. I totally glom onto what you're saying about using the vendor's GUI for backups, which was always kind of slow and out of step. And like you say, you can't integrate that into your workflow. If you have a workflow in like vRealize Orchestrator that adds the backup or adds the data retention, vendor B's GUI doesn't do that. It doesn't have a hook that you can tie in. So you still have that manual process where it's like, all right, stop. Let me go talk to my backup admin and add it to the backup set. Okay, now we can proceed on.
Right. And even my gripes kind of go beyond that point, because as I worked with different vendors, you'd find, like I mentioned, the kind of bolt-on API, where it's not really an API. It's just kind of, okay, a few of their major features get presented as an API, almost like as a fly swatter. Like, okay, you wanted these things, whoosh, there you go, you can have a few of them. But then they're not part of the main regression testing for the code, and it's never going to be feature complete and things like that. Or they charge you for the API, which is like, really, the licensing on most backup products is already the price of like a Maserati every month, and then you're going to charge me more to automate with it. It just feels dirty. So you have all these different kind of like malpractice lawsuits if backup were like legal and hospital type stuff going on. All we're trying to do is just take these ideas of like backing things up and restoring them and shove them into our cloud management platforms and our automated workflows. Like, come on, help someone out. give me a quarter here so I can call a friend.
Yeah, no, I absolutely agree. And that what you just said about the API not being feature complete, so we've only given you a little bit of the hook instead of having an API that our GUI itself is using. No, we have our own secret sauce that
Yeah.
you don't get to see. And I can't believe they charge people for it. The many times I've priced out backup solutions, sticker shock has always been a serious issue. Like, what? You're just storing data on big fat disks. How is it possibly costing that much money?
Exactly. And a lot of these folks, it's like 2/3 of their revenue is that. So I think all those things coalesce together, and it's like that's frustrating for the backup and admin and the business. It's non-trivial amounts of money, and you can't even really do meaningful things with it. You add all that together, and you get a lot of people that are just really wishing there was a better way to do things. So that also ties into why I joined with Rubrik, because we think we've got that.
Okay. Another thing that people talk about in the same breath with backup and data retention is the idea of disaster recovery. So, being able to at least stand up my environment somewhere else when the building explodes because a comet hit it or something. But to me, those are two distinct topics. You have your backup and data retention and then your disaster recovery. Do you feel the same way about that? And are there other things you find people mashing together with backup and data retention that should be their own topic or solution?
Well, I mean, first, I feel like the Comet gets a lot of play. I feel like I missed an opportunity by not going into Comet insurance. I think I could have really made quite a killing on that, because by the time you need it, everyone is SOL anyways. Going back to your actual question, though, yes, backup and recovery and disaster recovery I feel like they're two sides of a similar coin. Maybe it's like a four-sided coin, not completely opposites of one another. Even backup itself is different from recovery, because I feel like a lot of emphasis is put on backup from a vendor and not the recovery part. It's like, I can do 47 bajillion exabytes a minute ingest into my system. It's like, that's great. How fast can I restore it? Like, whoa, slow your roll there. How many at a time? And all these very qualifying questions.
Right.
So there's kind of that granularity, and the disaster recovery goes way beyond backup and recovery, because typically now we're talking multiple sites and orchestration, engines or workflows to get things back online, and all the activity goes around that. Plus, there's also, people tend to think of just the common example like you give, where everything's down, but more commonly than not, it's not the data center that fails. It's one application or one database set or one, critical component that cascades to other applications. So, the middleware and the web tier aren't down. They're just relying on a database that puked, and it takes 12 hours to bring that back up. So that's when you have to decide, do I want to recover it, or do I want to go to my DR plan and potentially then have to worry about bringing the data back? So they're definitely two different things to worry about, but kind of similar in their goals of bringing applications and services back online.
Right, yeah. Whenever I've done a disaster recovery plan, it's always been an application-focused plan. So what happens if this application goes down? Because I'm not so much worried about the whole data center. That usually doesn't happen. It's this application failed, like you said, for some either a cascading failure or a database puked or whatever it is. And can I fail it over to the other site or restore it at this site? And it's funny that backup vendors put such an emphasis on how fast they can back up your stuff and not the actual important part, which is restoring it when something goes wrong. Okay, that's when I actually care.
Yeah, I mean, don't get me wrong. You have to be able to be fast enough on ingest to hit the target. If you want to back up every 12 hours, the system has to be fast enough to do that. But no one really cares about that number, like whether or not if it's 12-hour window, if it's 11 hours to do the work or 4 hours. No one in the business gives a hoot about that. They just want to know about the other numbers, like how fast can I get my application back up? And typically those are the conversations you're having with the business around RPO and RTO. And those are, they want that distilled into measurements that are non-technical, like hours and days and minutes, things like that.
Right. You mentioned cloud services and coming from a cloud-based background. So in terms of backups, data recovery, data retention, all those types of things, how does that apply to the cloud-native applications and stuff like containers and storage accounts? What is someone supposed to do with that stuff?
That's a good question. I think it's a two-part answer as well. Like the cloud-native stuff really has been underserved largely. I think as far as data protection and backups and things like that go, largely because they don't take up a huge amount of the market, at least from an enterprise perspective, or at least from the perspective of those that are deploying it and looking for, seeking solutions. They're probably just doing skunkworks activities today to protect those, or, dumps and things like that. The interesting thing was I've seen a lot of kind of startups that have to post those little postmortems like, we were down and here's why. And I can't remember who it was, had this big, large postmortem where it was like, well, we thought we were backing up, and they had these really cockamamie, non-vendor driven backups that just was not working.
I think it was GitLab.
Yeah, that's exactly right. They didn't realize it until everything puked. So it's like you've kind of got that on one end. And then the other end, everything's kind of on a snowflake, right? Typically, if it's a virtual machine, we go through the hypervisor, we call whatever their API is, and we back it up. But if it's a native application, it may have its very own way of talking to it, like a NoSQL database. What do I hook into? What's the quiesce method? How do I tell it to put itself into backup mode?
Right.
So I think those are just challenges in perhaps as we are flexing our developer muscles and coming up with all these really interesting and awesome solutions that are kind of native to the cloud, kind of figuring out, okay, but we also have to protect this stuff. So maybe we should invest in a more common control plane for that. For right now, it means kind of talking to each application case by case, and what port do I have to talk to, and what structure of the command do I actually call for this application. So it's a little Wild West right now. But doesn't mean it's not important to do that. It just means that everything's a little nichey right now as far as talking to those applications. So the other part around containers, though, and storage accounts, talking to cloud environments, I think that boils down to the construction of the containers and really like what they're being used for. I remember seeing something recently that was doing the pets versus cattle versus bacteria, which is the third new classification of container that's like super, super short-lived. And okay, if we're protecting pets, that feels a little more normal. Containers are a bit more ephemeral. Probably we should be protecting the image store and the repository where the persistent data lives versus the container itself. And certainly for the bacteria, that's like the less than 5-minute running container, there should not be any stateful information in there at all. So that begs the question of, if you have something worth backing up in there, what are you doing? So It's kind of all across the board.
Yeah, that makes me think of something like functions as a service, where you just need that container to exist for 5 seconds or 30 seconds to run some function, and then it goes away immediately. So the only thing you really care about is the code that runs the function, not the container it runs in.
Exactly, and you back up that, I call it like the image repository, or basically the config or the code itself, and the actual functions as a service container that's instantiated to run whatever that may be. You don't care about that. That's a static binary or something.
Right. So let's talk a little bit about the actual Rubrik solution. Can you sort of describe in broad terms what the solution looks like and how it works?
Sure. I mean, it's basically a software stack that goes across physical hardware or virtual environments such as cloud environments, Amazon, Azure, et cetera, or even deployed as a virtual machine into a remote or edge site. But under the covers, it's a lot of distributed services like a task scheduler, a file service, a bunch of like self-healing and cluster awareness services, and services that go out and connect to virtualized and physical environments so that you can provide backup, recovery, archive, copy data management, et cetera, to those services, those applications. Everything is driven by a policy engine, so that when you work with the system, if you're not doing the API, you log into the graphics interface and all the nodes contribute to that. You can connect to whichever one you want. You actually map out all of the objects that are being protected, so the virtual machines from VMware or Hyper-V or whatever, or the physical sources like physical Linux or SQL or whatnot. And you can apply the policies, and the policies dictate the RPO, RTO, the replication, and the archive requirements. And then it's up to the system to holistically look at everything you're asking it to protect through these policies and figure out the best way to do that. So you could build just one policy, be like, gold, everything 4 hours, I have tons of money, and just back everything up holistically, just apply it globally to everything. And then the system would try to figure that out and keep data on-prem or potentially in the cloud cluster. And then you could say, okay, after, a week, go ahead and archive it to this S3 bucket or this object store or this NFS store or whatever, as well as perhaps you want to replicate for like a really low RTO to some secondary site or different data center. So really it's just, providing protection for all these applications and virtual machines and pieces of data and whatnot using policy instead of jobs and, pushing buttons. And then everything that you're doing is actually making API calls under the covers. So the HTML5 interface is all making API calls that you can actually see if you're in Chrome. You can hit F12, go in developer mode. You can watch all the calls. It's kind of fun and nerdy. I like to do it every once in a while. Or you can use our API Explorer and say, okay, what was I doing when I protected this asset? Okay, here's the code, and then drop that into like VRA or PowerShell or whatever it is that you enjoy. Fortran. I don't know if there is a way to call APIs of Fortran, but if you figure it out, that'd be kind of cool.
I'm certain someone has figured it out already. There's a lot of
so
Fortran fans.
Yeah, I mean, I learned on Fortran and COBOL, so I've been there.
So yeah, my next question was about if I want to use the API as opposed to the HTML5 GUI. What's the are there plugins for like Chef and Puppet or for vRealize, or is it more kind of roll your own at this point?
Definitely there's plugins. For VRA, there's a plugin. For PowerShell, there's a module. For Puppet, there's whatever their thing is, Manifest or whatnot. We have a lot of different pieces of work done for everything from VMware's vRealize suite to ServiceNow to all the configuration management tools. Some of them are open source on GitHub, some are not, depending on how much IP we put into it. But certainly we make it available to everyone that joins our family. And then, of course, you can roll whatever you want. You can just watch the commands through the GUI by hitting like F12 in developer mode, or just capturing the API calls and perhaps playing with them with Postman or our OpenAPI 2.0 Explorer, which used to be called Swagger. So you can play with it that way, or make curl calls directly if you want. It doesn't really matter. The API is always available. And again, we use it, so it's always feature complete, because someone was like, hey, can I turn the API off? I'm like, well, if you did, the product would stop working, because that's how we tell it what to do as well. So there's no like back channel, hidden API you have to worry about.
Right. ServiceNow is an interesting one, because I've been hearing that a lot as a sort of a workflow orchestration engine, even though that's not what their original mission was.
Yeah, and that one's. I mean, if you've not used it, it looks. For those that haven't used it yet, it looks kind of like a shopping cart experience. You put orders or like things in your cart, and then you check them out. And so what I found people doing is either kind of dashboardy systems so that you can look at the system, and that's not going to the shopping cart. That's just like, hey, how are my policies doing, and how are my backups going, and that kind of jazz. Or actually using the kind of shopping cart methodology where you're saying, I need some files or folders restored from X date, or I want you to instantly recover this workload. And then it's nice because you can put blocking tasks in there, similar to like vCloud Director, where you can say, oh, well, during this process, you need to get approval from your boss or something like that. Or leverage RBAC to say, well, you can't do that. I'm only going to limit your selection of choices to these 10 virtual machines, something like that. So it's a nice way to it's kind of like melding a CMDB and an orchestration engine and like an Amazon cart all into one. It's pretty groovy.
Yeah, the people I've talked to that have really embraced the ServiceNow service, that's redundant, they love it, and they keep adding new workflows into it because it is just that simple sort of checkout process. So maybe I need to dive into that a little bit.
Yeah, it's pretty popular. A lot of people, I mean, that's why we build the things we build, is someone says, hey, can you do ServiceNow? And we actually have a team called the Rangers internally that are just like DevOps tools ninjas. I wince a little bit saying the word DevOps in there, but you know what I mean? Like they can talk. They can talk to the operators or the devs and write code as well as write workflows and understand IT, infrastructure. So they kind of sit in both, maybe closer to like a site reliability engineer. Anyways, so they can write integrations to whatever people need, and then we add it to our internal knowledge. So that's a cool team to play with, to interact with.
Do they jump out of airplanes? Can they be aerially deployed?
Well, they are in airplanes a lot. I don't know if they jump out of them until they land, but it's probably...
That would make them real Rangers,
That'd be insane. I might sign up for that if they were paratroopers. That'd be pretty cool.
Yeah. The first iteration of Rubrik I came in contact to was really focused heavily on VMware. And for those that don't know, you have quite a history with VMware and a double VCDX. So did that drive the focus on VMware-based backups at first, or was that already kind of in the roadmap when you joined?
Yeah, that'd be really flattering if I had anything to do with that. But but no, I mean, one of the reasons that I think Rubrik was looking for me to join was the experience, so that I could have conversations with architects and engineers around how we work with VMware. But certainly, you just take a look at the ecosystem of data center spend, and you see, on the cloud side it was AWS, integrations with AWS, and on the data center hypervisor side it was VMware. So the 1.0 product was specifically VMware backup going to object store and S3. I mean, it was, you just picked the gorilla in the data center, and then since then we've expanded to, I think, 20 other integration targets. So it's expanded quickly.
Yeah, so I'm curious about that. What other cloud solutions and cloud services can now be leveraged?
Yeah, so from a public perspective, it's Amazon can be used for S3, like all the various tiers of S3 for storing archival data, as well as the EC2, and we can build AMIs and run them on EC2, both for the Rubrik cluster itself, so we can build our own cluster in Amazon, as well as taking VMware backups and running them as EC2 instances. Basically we build AMIs for you based on backups that you've archived in S3 from VMware. So there's a lot of work being done in the Amazon space, but Azure as well. You can build Rubrik clusters in Azure. We can instantiate a multi-node cluster in Azure based on our code base, as well as we allow you to use all of the various tiers of Azure's blob store. So you can pretty much store and run Rubrik in either, and you can start to run actual workloads in Amazon. And then everything else is just anything that kind of speaks S3, so like a Cloudian or a Scality object store, you can use them to archive to, as well as NFS. And that's kind of it on the public cloud side. Everything else has been around hypervisors and workloads. So we recently announced the integration with Microsoft Hyper-V. I know there's surprisingly a ton of people that are into that, especially with the 2016 release.
Yeah.
And Nutanix has the Acropolis hypervisor that we just announced an integration with. So there's a long list of stuff now. It was easy. I looked upon the good old days when it was just VMware and Amazon. I was like, oh man, it was really easy to be a subject matter expert when you have 2 integration points.
Right.
And now I'm looking at 20 something, and my team has grown to 4 people, and I'm like, I still don't have enough people to cover all the technologies we integrate with.
Right, and I got to imagine the integration testing has become much more difficult as well.
Yes and no. We're definitely into automation, as you can imagine, and APIs. So the engineering team, they're all ninjas that I stand near them to try to breathe their rarefied air because they're super smart. So a lot of the integration testing from like an object store perspective has been automated. The tool does everything it needs to do as far as calls to make sure that it integrates properly. Everything else is working with someone else's API. So that's a bit more of a challenge. VMware has VADP. Hyper-V uses WMI, and Acropolis uses its own set of APIs. So just making sure those are all good to go. But we actually have a team internally that does all of the automation for the testing, because we want every test to be automatic, and it's all going through like a build pipeline system. That's really impressive. I wish I could show off some of the crazy stuff these guys and gals are doing when it comes to automating the product. There's a lot of Docker going on, a lot of other cool things behind the covers, or underneath the covers, yeah. So it tends to get me all nerdy. Part of why I joined was to watch that process, because I've never seen a product get built before, and I think the guys at Rubrik and the gals at Rubrik do a pretty fantastic job.
Very cool. And I know you created a testing suite of your own for VMware configurations, the Vester project. Is that being used at Rubrik, or is that now just like its own entity?
Yeah, it's Vester. I mean, I kind of started it. I kicked the can down the hill. So far, I haven't contributed code in a while. A lot of people are moving the ball forward for me. The idea was just I had a lot of VMware environments in the house, and then when I joined Rubrik, we had a few VMware environments for our sales engineers and everything. And I realized, with everyone beating up on this environment, it's going to get really poorly configured in a hurry. So I wrote Vester, which is just vSphere and Pester, which is a unit testing platform put together, because we all know naming open source projects is the hardest part.
Right.
It's harder than the code ever will be. So made a really, really lame name for it. And yeah, it's been in production ever since. So a little over 2 years from now, it looks totally different than when I first started it. We actually got to present on it at VMworld last year, which was pretty groovy. So it definitely does sit there and make sure that all of my environments look the way they should look. And I'm actually going to be talking about it at Nutanix.next at the end of the month of June, because I'm hoping to expand it to other platforms.
Oh, okay. Well, that'd be awesome. I know we use Vester in our lab here at Anexnet to kind of keep things locked down, because we have a lot of our in-house engineers beating up on it to try out new things. And then when we need to get it back to a steady state, I'm like, all right, guys, I'm going to run the bester. We're good. Don't worry about it. So thank you for
Oh, sure. Yeah.
for creating that.
Yeah, we actually have it running. We got 4 major lab centers, and so it runs depending on what region it's in, like APJ. I don't want to run it in the middle of business for them, so they all the investor runs against the different environments at different times, and then we have a Slack bot that posts to a lockdown channel with all the summation of what did I find, what did I fix, that kind of stuff. So it's been running for quite some time. I'm very glad that I don't have to do that work manually.
Yeah, no, I totally agree. And if that gets expanded out to like Hyper-V or some other systems, I am totally in because I have to maintain those as well. Yeah,
that's the goal. As I'm feeling that pain, you will hopefully feel less pain because I got to solve that for me too.
Awesome. Yes, thank you. So in terms of future development for Rubrik, what's sort of on the product roadmap?
Yeah, so we just announced our 4.0 or Alta. It's a mountaintop launch, and in that we started expanding from vision to actual execution. We've always wanted to be the one-stop shop for protecting your applications, both on-prem and in the cloud. And those workflows go, on-prem to on-prem, data center A to B, potentially data center to cloud back to data center, and then cloud to cloud. Those are the 4 kind of different directions you can go. Mm-hmm. And with this release, we're just kind of executing even further on that vision by allowing you to take, like I was mentioning earlier, the VMware backups and instantiate them, or cloud on is the marketing term we call it, for provisioning those into the cloud using the same kind of shape that they are and matching an instance type to meet that shape in the cloud. So if you look at that, yes, today it's VMware going specifically to EC2, but now that we've expanded our hypervisor platform and we've expanded our cloud support, you can only imagine that we're going to keep going down that path and adding more directions that you can go, more formats that we support, so that you can really kind of choose what your environment looks like outside of production itself. Like you can decide, all right, if I got this database running here, I could potentially instantiate a copy of it in this other location where it's maybe cheaper or faster, or maybe 10 copies of it, run some analytics against all 10 copies in parallel, get my answer back, throw it away. There's a lot of interesting use cases that you can go through, and I definitely plan to demo some of those in late July at Cloud Field Day number 2.
Awesome. Yeah, it almost sounds like it could be a migration platform to a certain degree. I want to get from VMware onto Hyper-V and try it out, see if my stuff runs well on Hyper-V, or push it up to Azure and see if it runs well there.
Those are your words, but I like what you're thinking.
So you can't say anything. You're picking up what I'm putting down.
I'm giving you the nod. I'm giving you the nod. I like it.
All right. The knowing nod. I like it. So is the plan for Rubrik to keep narrowly focusing on what it's doing, or do you see it branching out into other adjacent markets?
I think it already has branched out a bit. We purposely tried to be very present and very visible in the backup and recovery space because everybody needs that. And the market's been really underserved from a technology and solution perspective. No one was like, yeah, this stuff is awesome. I love, like you were saying earlier, nobody's like, yeah, the backup software I'm using today, it's so amazing. I'm not going to look at anything else because this is just the bee's knees.
Yeah.
So it's always been an advantageous strategy to pursue that particular, I guess you'd call it market segment. It's also a $53 billion market segment. So it's not like we're chasing anything tiny.
Right.
But as an example beyond that, if you look at, again, in 4.0, we announced the SQL Live Mount technology where you can take a backup of your SQL database and actually present that without moving any data around to one or more SQL hosts, regardless of location. And actually, it's a read-write copy of the immutable data underneath it. That process takes a few seconds. And like I said, you can present it to as many hosts as you want at the same time using an API call. If you look at that, that means you could potentially run some queries, some schema changes, do a database health check. These are services you typically buy, I think, as a product that we're offering in this kind of first release as a choose your own adventure model. Maybe you're wanting to do it because you want to check a schema upgrade, or you're going for that database health check, or you just want to run one query against a couple tables, but the database itself is 7 terabytes and you don't want to have to rehydrate that. Right. So I think that's entering the realm of, okay, we're not modifying the application data and we're not sitting at like the database engine layer, but we're kind of somewhere in the middle and we're allowing you to do what makes sense within your workflow.
Yeah, I know database admins always get a little twitchy when they're about to do a schema upgrade or something. So if it's anything that can give them a little more peace of mind and a real version of production to test it against would make them infinitely happier.
Yeah, and they could even mount the live mount of that database directly to the database server to some secondary instance or even the same instance and rename it, so that the like for like is pretty good there. I understand you want prod to match everything else as close as possible, but without directly replacing production, this is pretty darn close, while maintaining the immutability of the backup and keeping everyone's dirty mitts off production. That's not where you test stuff. At least it shouldn't be.
It shouldn't be, but so many people, trying to maintain a dev instance of your production and keep it current, that's like a whole other team that has to handle that. So if you can automate that deployment and testing in some way, that makes everybody much happier.
Yeah, and that's one of the big use cases that I see beyond backup and recovery that everyone gets really excited about when they're using Rubrik. Because one example, this one team that I was working with, I think it was the greater part of 3 weeks every month that they would spend building this like test instance so that an outside auditor could come in and say, yeah, you can restore these 5 applications, check the box. And now it's just a scheduled task that runs at midnight that builds out the environment based on a few API calls to Rubrik and auto generates the audit report. They can do it every day for the entire suite, and now it takes nobody zero amounts of time. Like that entire beast amount of work that no one wanted to do is gone, and they can go do like the cool stuff now. And that to me, it's like, yes, give the high five for that, because no one wants to do that work.
Yeah, everything about automation is just to make my job suck less.
Yeah, I want to play more StarCraft, man. I don't want to do restoring copies of stuff to show an auditor. That's not fun. So
no, and it doesn't feel like you're doing anything meaningful either. You're just making sure a box is ticked by somebody. So yeah. I don't want to do that at all. And that's exciting about the AWS piece that you're talking about, just because AWS does not have a good native backup solution. It has snapshots, which are You want to create it as an AMI? That's some work. You want to replicate it? That's some work. And none of it's pre-configured. So if you can drop in a Rubrik solution to do all that for you, that's nice.
Yeah, and I imagine at some point AWS is going to get on the ball and improve that. But the one, I think, stickiness that we have in there is we work across all the cloud platforms.
Right.
We're not just saying this is the only environment you can work in. So you could spout on about lock-in stuff. I'm not too worried about that as much as I am about data mobility, and the ability to run the application where you think it works best, including all the services that it takes to back up that workload. You don't want to have to train yourself on all the 5 cloud providers you're going to be working with, because that's supposedly the number that the average enterprise customer has to deal with is like 5 or 6 clouds.
Mm-hmm.
You don't want to be trained to the nines on all of these. Like, here's all the nuances. Because we did an episode on the data knots on just the identity access management, the IAM for AWS.
I heard it.
And that was a whole show. Like, that was 45 minutes on just cliff notes on what to and not to do with security.
I know.
Then multiply that by all the other 900 things you need to know. There's no way. So that's why I like having our solution kind of in there.
Yeah, no, it makes sense. As someone who has personally wrestled with AWS IAM, I was just nodding my head the whole time. I'm like, yep, you got to do that. Oh, yep, that'll break something.
Yeah, it was a good show.
Yeah, no, I really enjoyed that. All right. People want to know more about Rubrik. Where would be the best place to take a look? And is it possible to take the software for a test drive?
Yeah, you'd want to go to Rubrik.com. We have a bunch of resources at the top there. If you click the resource button, we also have a YouTube channel where myself and pretty much everybody else on my team has done some Lightboard videos. So that'd be under Rubrik Inc. INC, Rubrik INC on the YouTubes. Or check me out on Twitter if you need anything. I'm at Chris Wahl, and you can just hit me up. As far as taking a test drive, if you're looking to engage with the sales team and actually have an SE come out and do some sizing and proof of concept, that's totally cool. The more ad hoc test drive, something I'm diligently working on, so I don't have anything to announce at this point, but soon, say.
Okay.
Because I know that's been a big ask everywhere, so I am working on it, I swear.
Yeah, I know that's one thing that people always want to get their hands on it before they try and buy or even engage the SE, because that's a whole process. You got to meet with someone and talk to them and get a unit shipped to you or something, or just the code. So yeah, being able to just like click a button like you do in AWS and boom, let me play around with it.
Yeah, I don't want to talk to a person, just a machine. Yeah.
Yeah,
Working on
absolutely.
it, I swear.
I work in IT. I don't like people.
Yeah.
That's not true, but
I don't like salespeople. No one likes salespeople. I'm cool with that. I understand.
yeah. Though we're all sales, right? That's what they tell me.
Yeah.
Apparently. So, what about you, Chris? If people want to hear more from you, where can they follow you on social media, blogging, etc.?
Fair enough. Yeah. So again, Twitter is usually the best at Chris Wahl.
Mm-hmm.
I don't follow it on the weekend very much, but during the week I'm reasonably active. Or you can follow wallnetwork.com as my blog, and then Data Knots podcast is the podcast. So any of those places, just throw me a line. My DMs are open. I don't mind if you harass me. I love it.
Hey, I harassed you, so that worked out.
you know for real, it works.
Yeah.
Like I'm not snooty about it. I don't mind being asked questions.
That's awesome. Anything else you want to talk about or bring up?
No, just if you're going out to VMworld, we'll be there. We'll be at .next coming up at the end of the month. We'll be at reInvent and Ignite and everywhere. So, and we're handing out these really cool custom T-shirts. The tech marketing team stole some budget, like literally we like stole it. We're like, this is ours, and skunk worked a set of graphics that are totally against the corporate marketing like theme. And we've got little Batman T-shirts, which rest in peace. I didn't know Adam West was going to pass away recently, so it's kind of an homage in a way to the greatest Batman that ever lived, in addition to some other shirts that are coming out. So if you're at any VMugs or PowerShell user groups or SQL Pass or something like that, hit us up, and we have these cool little T-shirts we're hanging out.
I'll be at the VMug this Wednesday in Pennsylvania, so I'll have to check that out.
Sweet.
All right, last question. I like to ask this for everyone. What is your favorite 80s movie?
Oh man, 80s movie. Flight of the Navigator is pretty good. That probably knee-jerk reaction. That one probably be up there.
Just popped right into your head, huh?
It did, because it had the voice of Pee Wee Herman and a flying saucer. I don't know.
Wow, that movie had a lot going for it.
It did. I like that one. Yeah.
All right, cool. I'll put you down for Flight of the Explorer. Awesome. All right, well, Chris Wahl, thank you so much for joining us on the Anexipod. I really appreciate it.
All right, thank you very much, Ned.
Sure. And that was our backup show with Chris Wahl. If you enjoyed the Anexipod and are looking for more content, why not check out our sister podcast, Buffer Overflow? On the show, I am joined by my co-host, Chris Hayner, and an assortment of other Anexinet colleagues to discuss what's new and interesting in the IT news sphere. Thanks to Catherine and Patty for helping me pull this together. Thanks to Lee Rosevere and Professor Click for providing the music for Anexipod. Thanks to Anexinet for helping me produce this podcast. If you're looking for a company to help you with your digital, strategy, or technology needs, then I would recommend reaching out to Anexinet to see how they can help. And finally, thanks to you, dear listener, for tuning in. If you'd like to know more about me and what I am up to, you can check me out on Twitter at Ned1313 or on my website, nedinthecloud.com. Thanks for tuning in, and remember, IT moves pretty fast. If you don't stop to look around once in a while, you could miss it.